At the beginning of this summer, I decided to tackle a hefty backlog of unplayed games in my Steam library. This pile has been growing for a few years now, with every big sale on Steam and every strong recommendation by a friend, a group of friends, or some random reviewers on the internet. This was certainly a very enjoyable experience overall. I played a total of 14 games since the beginning of this ordeal, and I have about that much more still to play. Most of the games so far were very good. Even if I didn't find some of them as enjoyable as some others, I recognize that this wasn't usually because the game itself was not good, but because it wasn't particularly my cup of tea. At least enough to play it beyond just completing the main story once. There were a couple of outliers, of course, that I genuinely think could have been a lot better, but overall I had a very good time with these games. However, none of them really ended up being that special to me, and thus at no point did I really pause my progress to spend more time with one of these games, and for only some did I even write short Steam reviews, let alone reviewing any of them on YouTube. As great as these games all were, I am a busy man and they really need to be something special for me to spend so much time writing a script for, then recording said script, and then editing a video around that. But as you can tell from the title of this video, this changed when I reached the 14th game on my list, BPM bullets per minute. I know that I'm very late to the party with this game, as it's been a couple years since the hype around it kinda sizzled out, and now we have Metal Hellsinger, which has been out for a couple months. But believe me when I say that you still have to play BPM if you didn't when it came out, as I can say with utmost sincerity that this was one of the most enjoyable games that I recently played. And unlike all the other games on my list I've played so far, I have so much to say about it that hasn't already been said by a million other people on the internet, both good and bad. Let's start with the former. Of course, the two most fundamental elements for a rhythm FPS are the music and the gunplay, and how well they complement each other. It is because the game excels at these fundamentals so well that I've enjoyed and put more time into it than any other game on my backlog so far, despite its numerous shortcomings that we're going to talk about later in the video. The soundtrack is just hype, and the definition of quality over quantity. If you're not aware, this game is not just any rhythm FPS, it's also a roguelike. I would feel obligated to explain what that means if I made this video like 5 years ago, but I'm sure that by now everyone is familiar with the term, as a lot of popular games in this genre have come out in recent years. If you don't know what a roguelike is, I'm sure you can find a million sources on the internet that explain it better than I can, so pause the video and take a quick Google search if you need to. Anyway, where I was going with this is that because it's a roguelike and each floor has its own soundtrack, as you may expect from these games, you end up hearing the same tracks over and over as you keep playing. In fact, there are only 12 tracks in the entire soundtrack of this rhythm game, which is kind of wild if you think about it. Like, I can't even think of another game off the top of my head that uses this few tracks. It's really impressive that I got sick of none of these, to be honest, especially when they're so integral to the gameplay and you have to keep your ears open for them to really get into the flow. They end up being more than just a background element for the atmosphere or the combat and take your full attention. And yet this somehow doesn't become tiring, because these tracks are not all just fitting for their areas, but also bangers to listen to by their own too, at least for me. Moving on to gunplay, it's very satisfying to see and hear the enemies react to being shot first and foremost. This is especially visible with some of the first enemies you encountered in your run, as they get stunned and lightly knocked back by your shots. The more powerful enemies you encounter in the later floors don't do the same, of course, but they still lightly jerk around or make noises when they are hit, which is enough to keep that satisfaction of seeing and hearing the enemies react to receiving damage. It's a small thing but vital among all the elements that make the game as fun as it is. The guns are also sufficiently varied to keep things interesting in such a repetitious game, and you are likely to come across a few of them at least once or twice during a run. From launchers to shotguns, pistols to rifles, there are a lot to be enjoyed, each with their own benefits and shortcomings. Most of the more powerful ones can shoot once every full beat, for instance, while the weaker ones can mostly shoot once every half beat. Less damage for twice the fire rate, basically. This is a very ordinary trade-off that most people can expect, of course. Same with the short range but high damage of shotguns, but there is more. Some weapons don't use ammo but energy, whose level is not displayed on the UI. You instead see infinite ammo. This is because the weapon can run out of energy just like a regular gun can run out of ammo, but the energy fills by itself a set amount passively each second rather than by reloading. So you kinda need to get a feel for it by using the gun. Speaking of reloading, that's also a huge deal when it comes to the overall fire rate. Some weapons can be reloaded in one move, while some 2 or 3. Some are reloaded by putting in each individual bullet by hand, so it takes a lot of time to reload a full clip, but the interesting thing with these weapons is that you don't have to fully reload a clip before you can start firing again. When using a revolver with 6 bullets, for instance, you can just reload 2 bullets when you run out and shoot them without having to reload the other 4. Thus, increasing the clip size of your weapons with an upgrade also affects these weapons both ways. Take the Grand, for instance, which can shoot every half beat and reloads a full clip in just a half beat too. If you have 4 bullets in a clip and increase this to 5, you effectively end up increasing your DPS as the reload time stays the same but the number of shots you can fire before reloading increases. With a clip of 4, it would take you 4 health beats to empty a clip and 1 health beat to reload, a total of 5 health beats. So in 30 health beats, you would end up going through 6 clips if you use each health beat to shoot and reload without pausing. 6 clips of 4 bullets each would mean you would end up shooting 24 times in 30 health beats. With a clip of 5 on the other hand, it would take you 5 health beats to empty a clip but still 1 health beat to reload, a total of 6 health beats. Thus, in 30 health beats, you would now go through 5 clips of 5 bullets, meaning that you would end up shooting 25 times in 30 health beats. But with a revolver, for instance, which you have to reload by hand, increasing a clip of 6 bullets to 7 bullets would make no difference in terms of DPS, because you would end up emptying a clip in 6 health beats and reloading one in also 6 health beats, to emptying it in 7 health beats and reloading it in also 7 health beats. There's still more to be said about more weapons, like how some are hit scan and some are projectile, some hit an AoE and some don't, and how some can even go through the enemy's shields. Needless to say, there is a lot of variety here to make each player have their own favorites. But weapon variety by itself cannot keep things exciting for dozens of runs, of course. You also need a plethora of different items around it to supply you with the possibility of having different builds in each run to ensure that the roguelike formula works and the player always keeps coming back over and over again for a new run. For this, we have a couple of consumable passive items like the skeleton key, which gives you infinite keys for the rest of the run to use on any chest or door you want, and the very lucky dice, which gives an immense and permanent boost to your luck stat. But the real game changer is the equipment, of which you can have 4 pieces at a time: headwear, handwear, armor and footwear. These give you different types of passive benefits while they are worn, and while some of them are boring setups like more damage or more speed, there are thankfully some that grant very unique effects too. One of them, for instance, transforms your weapons projectiles, which can especially make it more difficult to hit enemies for hit scan weapons, but it also makes them much stronger. Another one makes you able to carry 2 weapons rather than 1 and swap between them. The one issue with this is that you can only have 4 pieces equipped at once, which greatly limits how strong you can get during a run. If you swap a headwear for another headwear, you will lose the benefits of the first and gain the new ones of the new headwear. Same is the case for every other piece. Furthermore, a lot of these benefits that would synergize extremely well take up the same equipment slots, such as double damage and infinite ammo, both being bound to the armor slot. I mean, you already have infinite ammo for each weapon, so it's more like infinite ammo for each clip, but whatever, you get the point. However, there is a headwear that lets you swap around the pieces, letting you wear whatever piece in whatever slot if you use it. Thus, you can have 2 armor pieces worn at the same time, or 2 pieces of footwear, etc. There are also what's called prestige rooms that will turn all of your current equipment into passive buffs and free the slots for new pieces of equipment for 30 coins. This means that with enough luck, you can actually cheat the system, which shows how the developers are aware of what makes a good roguelike addicting: the intense desire to see how broken you can get despite all the odds during a run. With enough dedication, you can have infinite ammo, double damage and cooldown reduction, which makes it so that you can do everything twice as often, like being able to shoot each quarter beat rather than half beat, all at the same time. A combination which would more than quadruple your DPS. Add some more upgrades to this from your other slots and you can get some pretty absurd builds. Since we've just touched upon one of them, let's now get to all the different types of rooms and layouts you can come across as well, which is another key factor to the variety. As you may guess, you have treasure rooms, shops and challenge rooms as standard with such games, and they work exactly as you think they do. Treasure rooms have a chest to be opened with a key, which can give you a passive upgrade or a piece of equipment to wear. Shops come in 2 types, an armory and a, well, regular shop. The regular shop sells you healing potions, keys, shields, max health upgrades, and 2 random items which can be a piece of equipment or a passive upgrade like with the treasure rooms. The armory sells damage and clip extension upgrades as well as weapons. These are usually much more expensive than stuff you can buy at the regular shop, since switching to a more powerful weapon is usually the biggest game changer. Challenge rooms have regular enemy and boss variants and are optional to clear for a reward. Libraries are rooms that require a key to unlock and in turn give you a secondary or ultimate ability. You can have one of each of these equipped at once, and they can provide many different defensive or offensive utilities ranging from protective barriers to explosive projectiles. How often you can use them can also depend on a variety of different factors. Some have regular timed cooldowns, some are recharged by slaying a certain number of enemies, and some are recharged by clearing a certain number of rooms. Some don't have any sort of cooldown and instead cost some of your health or money. These abilities are another essential part of your overall build, like your weapons, stats and equipment, so libraries play an important role as the primary suppliers of these. Banks are where you can invest some of your money and then use it later whenever you want. You can withdraw from your account by visiting the same bank on the same floor after clearing all the rooms if you want, maybe because you found an armory where a weapon you really want is being sold for a hefty price. Or you can withdraw in a different bank in a completely different run even. Needless to say, the room can be a lifesaver, and the best part is that whenever you visit one for the first time, it supplies you with a free chest full of coins if you have more than 100 coins in your account. There are also two types of rooms where you can gamble for items, one for basic consumables like keys, health potions and shields, and the other for different stat upgrades, pieces of equipment or maximum health upgrades. Together, these pretty much make the bulk of the special rooms you will be seeing in each run, but there are a few that are much rarer too. We've already mentioned one of these, which are the prestige rooms, and the others include a black market where you can sacrifice some of your health for items, one where you have to choose one of 4 different pieces of equipment offered to you, after which the others disappear, and one where you can directly teleport to another floor of your choosing without finishing the current one. It's important to note that portals to previous floors may also appear in this room, letting you basically start the run over with your current items so that you can become even stronger by the end with many more upgrades than you would otherwise have. But we can't end this topic without mentioning the rest of the regular rooms where you fight enemies and bosses. Keep in mind that none of these can be empty except for the room that you start in when you reach the current floor. If there is an unexplored room on your map without a special icon, then you will encounter regular enemies or a mini-boss inside it. If it has a skull, it is a boss room. Boss and mini-boss rooms always have 1 or 2 enemies inside and directly in front of you, with always the same layout and nothing else interactable in the room, so there isn't much to say about these besides the enemies themselves, which we'll get to in a moment. But rooms with common enemies are a whole different story. Not only can they have a variety of different layouts, but the batch of enemies you face inside them are always familiar, yet have some unpredictability to them as well, especially as you keep increasing the difficulty. There are a couple of special enemy types like guardians and ice witches that may or may not appear in a lot of rooms, and these are usually trickier to deal with than the rest of the enemies. All the other enemies will always seem familiar when you enter the same type of room in different runs, spawning in about the same locations in similar numbers and assortments, among which you can fail to spot a carefully placed guardian that may be your doom, especially if you're all low health. Or he can be placed to your left or right when you enter a room, for instance, a direction you would not immediately think to look at with so many enemies you can see directly in front of you to shoot or dodge. This can even happen with the rest of the regular enemies in some rooms, so it's always a good idea to check your immediate surroundings when entering a room, and also looking carefully at all the enemies inside to see if you can spot a guardian among them. Even after this initial scan, you have to keep that awareness of your surroundings at all times, especially in crowded rooms. Enemies can and will attack you when they're outside of your vision. Ranged enemies can especially be a problem, as simply keeping your distance from them is not enough to dodge their attacks. You have to pay attention to the direction of their projectiles as well, and thus they can be overwhelming in large numbers. But it doesn't even end there, since certain enemies that you would only expect to see on the later and harder floors gain a chance to appear much earlier next to the usual enemies on earlier floors as you up the difficulty from easy to hard. And things become even crazier when on the next and final hellish difficulty, when even mini bosses may start to appear in regular rooms. All of this keeps the player on edge during combat and pushes them to constantly be aware of their surroundings. When coupled with a low amount of health left on your character, this is where the game truly shines the most and really gets you into the flow by taking your full focus and putting you in a sort of trance where you truly start to excel at the rhythm game. It was times like this where I found myself doing the most flawless clears in even the hardest types of rooms, never missing a single beat without even realizing it, and performing my longest streaks. These were the times where I noticed all of a sudden during a calmer moment after an intense and risky battle that I had subconsciously started to slightly headbang or tap my legs synchronously with each beat while playing. I've had moments where I clutched the final boss with 1 hit left, where I've cleared multiple rooms in some of the later floors with just 1 hit away from death, even with guardians in them, until I found a shop to replenish my health. There have been runs where I died to a boss when they were just a couple of hits away from dying, and runs where I died in a room to the last enemy. Regardless of whether I was victorious or defeated by the end, the moments up to it were when everything in the game just clicked in the most perfect way possible and convinced me that it was something special that I had to make this video about it. Don't get me wrong, you'll still be trying to do your best in the earlier and easier floors, comfortably sitting at full health just in order to keep your multiplier up to feel stylish and cool, but there isn't really much of a penalty for missing beats besides losing your multiplier and the attack or dash you wanted to perform not executing. The latter could cost costs you a few health points, but you can still move and jump whenever you want to dodge, allowing you to juke a lot of attacks anyway if you have enough speed or momentum with good timing and awareness. You will get better throughout multiple runs overall as you get more experience with the game, but it's only when push comes to shove and you think about surviving rather than feeling cool that you make fewer and fewer mistakes during the same run. This is what makes BPM such a good rhythm shooter. It's an FPS roguelike that knows how to make rhythm its backbone. Keeping up with the beat is literally like breathing when you think about it. It's when you don't do it manually but subconsciously that it becomes more natural to you. The next thing to mention is that in every room with an encounter against common enemies, a chest will drop once you clear it. And not only does it often contain important consumables like coins, health potions and keys, but it can sometimes be a locked chest too, which may offer you an upgrade, equipment piece or even a weapon. But the real things to look out for are altars, Damocles swords and cursed chests. Each regular encounter room has exactly one of these in them. Altars can be of two types, for stats or for items. Stat altars grant you a point of a stat for a coin, which is a terrific trade-off, so it's always useful to be on the lookout for them. They usually end up being the main sources of your stat ups as they are so abundant overall. The item altars come in two types, one accepting coins and the other accepting keys. For a few of these resources they can offer you upgrades, equipment or abilities. Damocles swords take away some of your health and give you a bag of coins, a key or a max health upgrade in return. The great thing about this is that you can see what you're going to get before sacrificing some life for it. It's not a random reward. Lastly, cursed chests come in sets of 3. 2 of the chests contain flies and only one of them actual loot. It can be anything from shields to maximum health upgrades to equipment to abilities. Just don't expect any weapons. A weird thing about these though that keeps happening to me is I'm always so lucky with them. I've opened countless sets of cursed chests and I always find the item in the first or second chest I open, never the third. I'm not sure if this is because it's not predetermined where the item will be and the luck stat affects how many chests you need to open before you find the item, but even if this is the case, it's a bit too generous with it in my opinion. But even this is not all, as there can be sometimes a third interactable hidden somewhere in the room. It can be an additional item altar or a chest with some good loot, sometimes even a weapon. These are often located in hard to reach places and you need to have a good look around the entire 3D space of the room before spotting them or where they can be. Some can be literally unreachable without sufficient upgrades, but some are, so it's always good to look around for these as well, especially if you are carrying a large number of keys or coins to spare. You may end up getting a powerful weapon for a single key this way instead of paying 30 coins for it in the armory. These add a simple yet fun layer of minimal exploration to the game and reward the player nicely for having a keen eye. Any element of exploration more involved would not fit so well with the fast action-packed nature of the game anyway. The next thing to go over is the set of playable characters, which is where some of the most impeccable design choices in the game make themselves apparent. Keep in mind also that while during this section I will not try to pronounce the names of any of these characters because I don't trust myself in doing it correctly. You can see all of their names while they're on the screen. I will instead use simple but descriptive nicknames to refer to them. The first few characters are not all that crazy as they essentially just differ from each other in terms of their starting loadouts. You got the starter girl that's unlocked by default and has the most basic loadout with the pistol and 100 health points. You can unlock a default secondary ability and a default ultimate for each character by beating the game as them on easy and on hard respectively. She remains pretty basic in this regard as well, getting a fireball projectile as her secondary and a much stronger version of it as her ultimate. Then you got the shield guy that starts out with 150 points of shields as his health bar and no maximum health. So it's usually a good idea to look for some health upgrades early on to have a life bar that you can easily regenerate with potions and the like. He also starts with the revolver, which is not the best starting weapon out there, but it surely does wonders compared to the basic pistol. His abilities are both defensive but are arguably some of the strongest in the game, his ultimate allowing him to regenerate his shields and his secondary ability blocking all kinds of damage for a brief period, about 3 health beats, and recharging quickly also, about 8 health beats. You can imagine how strong this can be, especially with the upgrades to your ability stat, which increases the power of your abilities for more damage, heals, longer durations, and etc. The fast girl is the most underwhelming character in the game in my opinion, so much so that I would call her the only poorly designed character in the game. She just starts with a lot of extra speed and that's it. Besides that, she has a bad starting weapon, less total HP than the rest of the characters we've talked about so far, and the same secondary ability as that of the starter girl and not even something of her own, and an ultimate that makes her go even faster, which might be the least exciting ability I can even think of. Oh, and she starts out with an extra key too. I honestly can't think of anyone that would put this character among their favorites and feel excited to play as them. She feels like an extra next to the others, like an NPC NPC disguised as a playable character. It's from this point on where things get really crazy though, and the game's design quality shines once more with an incredible assortment of unique characters. We got Mr. Catch These Hands, who cannot carry weapons and is always forced to use his hands for combat, from which he shoots magic bolts. The problem is that the base damage of this magic is quite low, to the point where never having to reload does very little to compensate for it honestly. Since you are bound to stats and equipment to get stronger, it's a lot more restrictive to play this character, but in a good way in my opinion. Your hands basically work like a pistol with infinite ammo, low base damage and able to shoot once every half beat. It doesn't help that both of your abilities have defensive utilities either, one being a heal and the other being a barrier. The fact that you can't just swap your weapon to something with more ranged, more AoE or more base damage, or one that can penetrate shields, pushes you to look for these solutions with the help of your upgrades and equipment more. It reduces your options, and when you can't find any such equipment either, you have to get good. It's like the game is forcing you to play a pistol only run, which I guess doesn't make the character as special as I made him sound at the beginning if you think about it, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Miss Steal Your Life is a character that starts out with a ton of maximum health, but her HP slowly decays constantly. The way you keep it from ever reaching zero and dying is by her innate lifesteal, which is stronger than the lifesteal you can get from items, so it's actually simple to sustain your HP, or even increase it above where it was when you entered the room, as long as you keep shooting and avoid receiving unnecessary damage. This makes it so that quite uniquely, the most stressful times you spend while playing this character is not in combat but out of it, which makes your playstyle contrast greatly with the rest of the cast. See, as long as you are good enough at the game, combat becomes much less stressful than it normally would be, as you keep regenerating at such a rate, especially against singular enemies with large outputs like bosses and mini-bosses, that even getting hit a couple of times could not be enough to get you down to less health than what you had when you entered the room. Combat becomes less punishing, and every second you spend outside of it becomes more punishing. Every second you spend without shooting is a detriment to your current HP, so you have much less time than normal to make decisions on what to buy in shops, look for interactables in rooms, and backtrack if you want or need to. In a way, the game is forcing you to kind of speedrun it, especially in the early sections when you're at your weakest with no additional health upgrades or shields, which can prevent you from dying by your health decay since they are not affected by it. Her abilities do not complement the rest of her kit extremely well, but are very powerful nonetheless. Her ultimate can especially be broken when you have a skeleton key. It allows her to conjure a locked chest out of thin air, which can contain all sorts of epic loot from weapons to pieces of equipment. The small furry has a 100% chance to get a bank on each floor, which can be insanely strong as you might guess. Not only does it allow you to farm a lot of coins to use in the future, but always having the option to withdraw more than 100 coins in a run on any floor you may need to is sometimes a game changer. The reason I'm saying 100 is because this character stays unlocked as long as you have more than 100 coins stored in the bank. Yes, you heard me right. He doesn't unlock at 100, he stays unlocked above 100. If you ever fall below 100 coins again after unlocking him by withdrawing, the character will become locked again. I had found this to be a questionable design choice at first, but I've actually grown to like it. It's interesting to see a spin on not only the gameplay mechanics of a character, but its unlock mechanics as well. It kind of reminds me of Eden coins from The Binding of Isaac. Plus, once you discover this, it rarely becomes a problem. I decided to keep storing coins in the bank to stay at a comfortable distance away from 100 so that I would never have to worry about falling below that line and losing the option of playing as this character again. The other characteristic of the small furry is that he is, well, small, and this reflects the gameplay. Your camera is inches away from the ground, but I find that this doesn't really affect the game much for me in terms of difficulty. It's rarely the height of your camera that's the problem or the advantage in most encounters. Coin Man is my personal favorite. Instead of a regular health bar, his health is dependent on the number of coins he has. Every time he gets hit, he loses half of his coins, and if he gets hit while at a single coin, he dies. This is such an extremely good design choice in my opinion, since you still use coins to buy stuff as you do with everyone else. Getting hit while carrying a lot of coins makes you lose a ton of them, and carrying a tiny amount makes you squishy. Because it's always half of your coins that you lose, you can never really tank up and be safe to the extent you can with other characters either. Even having 64 coins on you, for instance, which is kind of a ridiculous amount in most cases, would only allow you to get hit 6 times without dying, and the 7th would kill you. This is the equivalent of 175 health points, even less if you have the damage reducing armor, 105 health points, just a little over the default character's base health. You can also add to the equation that you cannot benefit from things like lifesteal items, passive health regeneration provided by the quest ability, and even the 1x extra life item. However, there are other ways to increase your survivability as Coinman. Certain abilities provide you with additional coins every now and then. The ultimate ability you unlock for beating the game on hardest turns every item in the room into coins. There's also a piece of equipment that makes you find more coins on average, and the luck stat increases the chance of dropping more coins from enemies and chests also. This means that while you cannot lifesteal, you can sustain yourself during the battle even if you keep getting hit, as long as you can regularly collect the coins that your enemies drop upon getting killed. With any other character, you would have to wait until you cleared the whole room to maybe get a health potion as a reward from the chest drop, which would just heal 1 or 2 hits of damage. What also helps is that you don't have to deal with all those pesky maximum life upgrades to tank up to your heart's content if your DPS is already good enough and you want to save your coins for survivability, which you usually need in the last few floors. With any other character, you could drop all the health potions you want, but you couldn't use them all if your maximum HP didn't allow it. With Coinman, that's not a problem since you don't have a maximum number of coins you can have, or at least even if you do, it's so high that I never discovered it. All these things put such a unique spin into playing the game as this character and introduce a ton of new decisions to make, especially in the shop and the armory. How much of your money should you spend on a weapon or item? It might increase your power level greatly, but you will also leave much squishier than when you had entered the shop. The decision might end your run in the next room or the other if you're on a difficult floor, but if you think you might get it anyway, you might as well spend your money right now because you'll lose it otherwise before getting to use it. The Damocles swords are also affected, for instance. Since you get the reward before getting hit by the swords, if you're at 1 or 2 coins, you can actually use one that gives out a bag of coins to heal. At 2 coins, for instance, you get 4 more from the bag, and then when the sword hits you, you lose half of your total 6, which is 3, leaving you at 3 coins. So overall, you end up healing rather than receiving damage. For Damocles swords with other rewards, the situation becomes trickier. While other characters would lose only 25 HP or even less with armor, you would lose half of your coins for an item. Without rambling even more, what I'm getting at is that Coinman basically changes the way you play the whole game without taking much away from it, unlike Mr. Catch These Hands, for instance. I'd argue in fact that he makes it more fun. Like I said, he is my favorite character, and all I've just told you is not the only reason behind why that is. He also starts with the bolt action rifle, which is one of my favorite weapons. The sound of the weapon, the reload animation, all of it's just top tier. And lastly, let's not forget that he starts out with snipe as a secondary ability too, which is a powerful long range projectile that annihilates single targets, especially in the early game. Lastly, we have 3 more characters that I'm going to go over quickly. LOLSO Random XD is a character that starts with a random assortment of HP and shields, a random weapon, a random piece of equipment, and if you're lucky, a random secondary and even ultimate ability. There's not much beyond this to say about the character, as he's just there to let the player experiment with how broken of a start they can get. Mr. and Miss One Shot are both characters that die in one hit. Mr. One Shot can jump infinitely though, basically allowing him to fly wherever he wants to, and he starts with a double barrel shotgun. Miss One Shot on the other hand starts with the basic pistol, normal jumps, and she has to visit all the rooms in the floor before she can face the boss and move on to the next floor. I'm going to be honest here, these are 2 characters that I didn't spend a lot of time with. I spent absolutely no time with Miss One Shot in fact, since you need to beat the game with Mr. One Shot to unlock her, which I didn't do. Simply put, I'm not good enough to play with these characters and I don't have the patience or the time to get that good either. Even though this was my favorite game on the backlog so far, like I've said in the beginning, I'd rather move on to a new game rather than spending another 30 or even more hours with BPM just to complete everything with these 2 characters also. We'll get into more reasons behind why that is later in the video, but for now let me just say that even though they're not really the type of challenges I want to take on for myself, I appreciate these 2 characters for being put in the game for players that do want to take them on. They're not really a negative about the game even though I don't want to deal with them, quite the opposite. But speaking of negatives, it's finally time to get into them. There aren't many of them, but they unfortunately make themselves quite noticeable as you put more time into the game. Let's start with the least offensive of these that distracts the least from the experience, and that's some of the questionable design choices in the game's presentation. The first culprit is the character select screen, which always greets us with the default character whenever we enter the main menu. This is because the transition between the main menu and the character select is seamless and instant, and the default character is in that cover art pose. This is very cool and all, but it's when you start scrolling through all the other characters that you realize she is the only one doing a pose at all, and I can't help but wonder why that is. She's frozen in this pose of hers while all the other characters are just standing around idly, not even frozen. They're looking around and slightly moving and stuff. It just creates such an odd contrast. If it was difficult to find a unique pose for each character and implement it here, then I think none of the characters should have been given one rather than just one of them. You could have the cover art of the game in the title screen and the background of the main menu and have each of the character models stand idly on the character select screen. Not only would it be more consistent, but it would allow us to see the full model of the default character as well. At its current state, it's mostly left to our imagination what she looks like below the shoulders, unlike the other characters, which is a shame because most of the character designs in the game look pretty good in my opinion. It's actually yet another reason why I like Coinman the most. His design is among the sickest in my opinion, beaten only by Mr. One Shot and LoL so random XD perhaps. Secondly, I want to mention one weapon in particular, and that's the Burst SMG. All I'm going to say is that this weapon alone makes me understand the seizure warning given at the beginning of the game. I don't understand what it is about this weapon in particular, but the muzzle flash bothers me so much. There are worse offenders in this regard like the minigun, but that for some reason doesn't have the same effect on me as much. Plus, I could understand it for that weapon, but for the Burst SMG, the strength of the weapon is not enough to warrant all the torture that epileptic fellas out there may experience if you ask me. It's barely a better alternative than the basic pistol. Lastly, there is some general blandness to the enemies and environments in the game in my opinion, and this only bothers me because the developers clearly show what they can pull off with areas like the item shop in this regard. The shop's operated by one of Odin's ravens, but instead of an actual raven you get smashed between like a cardinal bird and a chicken with the tiniest wings, and he dances around excitedly as you're shopping, while in the meantime this chill and groovy tune plays in the background, contrasting greatly with all the other stuff you have been and will be hearing during your run. It feels like a safe haven where you can take a breather and comfortably shop for items that will get you back on your feet while vibing with your giant adorable friend. This single area is brimming with so much character, and no other room that you can encounter during your run is anywhere close to this in my opinion. I'm not asking for every special room to be like this, but some like the gambling and prestige rooms could have been more than just the dark and empty chambers with the object of interest highlighted that they are. I'm not asking the game to be a quirk fest like a Borderlands title at all, where bad joke after meme after reference hits you and lands about as well as a flower pot thrown off the 10th floor. But I don't know, maybe some of the altars could have had some funny twist to them really. Maybe there could be some scribbles or text or something you could see on some walls if you looked closely. Some enemies could also look more interesting, especially the bosses. There are some more comedic looking ones here and there, but they start looking more and more generic, especially in the last few floors. The final boss is probably the worst offender since it's just a generic looking big dragon, making all the previous bosses look a lot more interesting next to him. All I'm saying is that good enemy and environment design sprinkled with some fun details add so much character to a game by themselves. You can look at Hades for a good example in the same genre. Think of how after enough encounters with the Lernian Hydra, Zagreus starts calling him Lerny, and this also reflects on the life bar from then on during the boss fight, or how a single one of the shades around the arena where you fight TCs and the bull is rooting for you, and if you approach him after winning the fight, Zagreus will thank him for his support. Small things like this do a lot in making players fall in love with your game, and it's why BPM gets Steam reviews like the bird is the best part, and comments under the shop team on YouTube like you have entered the good boy zone. Since we've just mentioned the bosses, let me go over them next. Pretty much everyone that played the game will likely agree on how the boss encounters are jokes compared to a lot of normal rooms with the common enemies. Mini bosses are even worse. They're such pushovers that finding out that I entered a mini boss room instead of a regular enemy room makes me feel relieved instead of stressed, because I know that I'm not going to get hit unless I act like an idiot. It's not that different with main bosses either. In any other game I could think of, the bosses would be the real challenge and not the common enemies. Ideally you would want both to challenge the player in some way, but if one of them is going to be there as cannon fodder, it would ideally be the common enemies and not the bosses and mini bosses. What's worse is that you always fight the same boss on the same floor. 8 floors and 8 bosses, only one for each. There are some modifiers that make them have more health, be mostly invisible or be cloned, etc. But even with these it quickly gets old to fight the same 8 bosses over and over. In many other games in the genre you would expect the earlier floors to have at least a modest pool of possible bosses they can throw at you, and for one to be randomly selected from among those each time. Or you would at least have much more significant modifiers for them like the extreme measures in Hades. Problems in variety doesn't end with the bosses either, and this is the next big shortcoming of the game in my opinion. Now it's fine if it's not the game's goal to have the players spend hundreds of hours playing it like The Binding of Isaac or Risk of Rain 2, but even at 30 hours, which is a very modest amount of time to spend on a roguelike that you enjoy in my opinion, it began feeling like I was having the same runs over and over, which mostly has to do with the limits of variation and power level in this game. Enemy variety is the least problematic and the easiest to fix besides the bosses and mini bosses we mentioned. As I've said much earlier in the video, there can sometimes be a couple of stronger enemies sprinkled among the regular enemy assortment in a room, like guardians and ice witches. And things get even crazier as you up the difficulty. You can encounter enemies you'd regularly regularly expect to see in much later floors like these robot dudes in even the earliest floors in hard mode. And in hellish mode, even mini-bosses get added to the list of what you can encounter in normal rooms, although quite rarely. Still, this provides some good enemy variety, but it could even be better if we could let the challenge room exclusive enemies take a stroll outside too. I find it to be a really questionable design choice to have challenge rooms have their own enemy pools, throwing foes at you that you can't encounter anywhere else. It seems like a big missed opportunity for the rest of the game, especially since you could easily make the challenge rooms live up to their name by having a tough assortment of enemies to be encountered in them rather than unique enemies that you cannot encounter anywhere else. The game could be far more interesting in my opinion if you could sometimes encounter these challenge room enemies in normal rooms too. But the real problem is the limitations in item pools and stats. I can't begin to tell you the number of times I found tons of stat alters after one of my stats were already maxed out, and I just don't understand why a cap is there in the first place. To exemplify how bad this can get, take an item like the Midgard bracelet for instance, which gives you +1 of each stat at pickup and then +1 each time you finish a floor. By itself, if you find it in the first floor, it's nearly enough to cap all of your stats by the end of the game. But then what are all the altars, chests that can drop stat ups, and all the stat ups that you can buy for if you get it? And if you still grab those stat ups to increase something like your damage early on while keeping the bracelet on to increase all the other stats slowly, then you end up never benefiting from the damage up you would get from the bracelet in the later floors because your damage is already capped by the time you finish the 4th floor and 4 more are left. This could happen with any stat and even with multiple of them at once. For how many different ways of increasing your stats you encounter on each floor on each run, the maximum limit for these stats is absurdly low and I don't understand why that is. What is the game trying to balance? It's not like there's any PvP involved, and isn't the whole point of a roguelike seeing how crazy your builds can get? Yes, you can buff your stats beyond their limits with equipment like double damage and speed multipliers, but again, a lot of these cannot combine with each other due to occupying the same slot unless you find a prestige room and or that one headwear piece that lets you wear whatever you want in whatever slot, which happens so rarely with the right items like say double damage and cooldown reduction on the same run, that it leaves me at this weird place in each of my runs where I am really strong and having an easy time with all the bosses and enemies, yet it never truly feels like I'm able to melt everything. By the time I reach the final boss, I'm almost always at a high amount of health and damage with which I beat him easily, but I can never beat him in say like 4 seconds because of all these limitations, even if I manage to get all the strongest items I can get during that run. Because my options are so limited, I find myself equipped with the same few items each time by the end of a run, which is why, like I said at the beginning of this section, a lot of my runs began to feel all samey after a while, at just like 15 hours into the game I'd say. But what has more to do with this is the item variety. Simply put, there aren't enough items in this game to keep things interesting and different enough most of the time after a certain point, and again, that point comes very early into your total playtime. The fix for this couldn't be more straightforward than adding new items of course, and I could think of a few right now even off the top of my head. One would be a money is power type item where the more money you have, the more damage you also have, which would make the decision making process while shopping for items more interesting as well, like it is with Coin Man. A lot more summons like the Valkyrie one with different effects and attack patterns could also be introduced, like one that life steals for you or one that drops better loot from enemies if it manages to deal the finishing blow to them. Familiars could also be a thing, as the passive versions of these summons with their own different effects. They would naturally have to deal less damage than their briefly summoned counterparts of course. Charm abilities could also be a thing, where you make one of the enemies attack their friends for you. A powerful ultimate that freezes all the enemies in the room for a certain period that has a lengthy cooldown perhaps. There's a lot of potential here to say the least. But furthermore, these items could also be implemented in the game as new rewards for beating certain challenges, which would kill two birds with one stone. To understand what other thing I'm talking about besides fixing variety here, it's time to talk about the last yet most significant flaw of BPM, the way the game challenges and rewards you in general. Let's begin with all the difficulty options in the game. You can choose between 4 of them: practice, easy, hard and hellish. I've only touched practice mode once right before recording for this video to try out how easy it actually is, and I can confidently say that it's actually for babies. Enemies deal about 12 damage per hit, which is stupidly low. Then there's easy, in which you are dealt 25 damage per hit. Then hard, in which you can sometimes encounter a few harder enemies earlier on, but there is no change between it and easy besides that from what I can tell. And finally hellish, in which you have an even higher chance to deal with harder enemies earlier on, and sometimes even mini bosses in common enemy rooms. Each of them also deals 50 damage to you with each hit, has 50% more health, and you can never drop health potions from chests unlike all the other difficulties, so you usually end up spending most of your coins from health potions from the shop to heal. Add to the equation that each hit you take requires a large potion to heal it as well, and you only get 3 of those in a shop and 1 shop per floor, so it suffices to say that this difficulty is pretty brutal and provides a great challenge to the players that want to truly test themselves. But the problem with these difficulties is that you only get rewarded for beating easy and hard. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting the inclusion of a reward for beating practice mode at all. It would legit be embarrassing if someone couldn't do that in the first place. But when it comes to the other 3 difficulties, it's baffling to me how you only get unlocks for beating the game on easy and hard, because they might as well be the same difficulty. Like I said, the only difference between them is you can sometimes get harder enemies on early floors when playing hard, and that's pretty much it. You get the same loot, enemies have the same health, and they deal the same amount of damage. Since the only difference between the 2 difficulties has a chance of occurring rather than a guarantee, you can clear many rooms back to back without ever seeing an indicator of which difficulty you're on even. The first few times I was playing to get unlocks for hard mode, I actually had to pause the game and make sure that I was on the correct difficulty because it was so indistinguishable from easy at times that I had to double check. I can't see someone that beats easy with a character to ever struggle on hard with that same character, if I'm perfectly honest. The fact that you get different awards and achievements for them should indicate a larger gap in difficulty between the 2 in my opinion, but it doesn't. In fact, I'd say that when you unlock a character for the first time, it's better to directly jump into hard without bothering with easy, since it's basically the same experience, and if you beat it, you get the achievements and unlocks for both difficulties for that character. To add insult to injury though, you get nothing for beating the final hellish difficulty despite it being miles above hard in terms of challenge. I've only managed to beat it with 2 characters in fact as I'm writing this part of the script, Missteal Your Life and Coin Man, because one has lifesteal by default and the other heals with coins which can still drop in hellish unlike health potions. You also don't receive extra damage as him and lose half of your coins upon getting hit like always. With anyone else, I couldn't even get to the halfway point of the run yet. It's absolutely absurd to me that there is no award at all, not even a Steam achievement, let alone an in-game unlock for beating this difficulty. Well, except if you do it with miss one shot, then you get an achievement because you just did the hardest thing to do in the game. At least the devs have that much courtesy, I suppose. It is just as bad, if not worse, when it comes to the challenges however. There are 10 of those and I would call only 3 of them actual challenges. The rest I beat in at most like 3 tries I think. The problem with those is that they give you certain restrictions but none of them are enough by themselves to make the game difficult in my opinion. The pistol only run isn't really hard enough when you are still allowed to find or purchase all the stat or equipment upgrades in the world. The retro run just hurts your eyes a bit and makes enemies kind of hard to spot from a distance, and that's it. And no shop or treasure means very little when you can still find all the health, upgrades, weapons and whatever you need through other means. All the altars and other special rooms are still available. The fixed seed challenges are interesting as the idea for a challenge. I can easily see a game challenging me with a very unfair seed and it working quite well. Bad item drops, a difficult to navigate map and strong enemies from the very start with no way for me to restart the run with the hopes to get a better start because it's always going to be the same and I have to face it as it is. It's a brilliant idea but it falls short on its execution since, to be frank, these seeds aren't challenging at all. They don't feel any different from any other seed in my opinion. This is kind of a byproduct of the variety issue we talked about earlier regarding the items and enemies. When you have so little variety in your game anyway, how much can you really force the player to work with a bad build? They'll eventually come across some really good items and weapons on one of the 8 floors anyway. A challenge like this would work much better in a game like Isaac or Risk of Rain 2. Super Time is an interesting challenge where you and the enemies can all move on just the beats, but it doesn't really affect the difficulty much in my opinion beyond making the game look like it's running on 1 FPS. And all of these are still fine compared to the biggest offender among these challenges, Full Auto. This quote-unquote challenge is simply mind-boggling because what it does is give you the cooldown reduction item as an innate ability and nothing else. So it actually makes it easier than a normal run by providing you with a broken item from the get-go. It would be an interesting and perhaps even difficult challenge if the enemies could also fire faster and move faster, like every half beat instead of every full beat for instance, but no, it just affects you and nothing else. So then why exactly is this called a challenge? If anything, it should be called a cheat. Where is the challenge? I don't get it. Last time I checked, the definition of the word suggested something that is the literal opposite of this, but whatever I guess. At least the other 3 challenges besides these I can actually get behind because they are legitimately difficult. One requires you to beat beat all the bosses back to back with nothing but a completely non-upgraded basic pistol and no heals, items, abilities, etc. And the other requires you to do the same without getting hit even once. Even though the bosses in the game are normal pushovers like I mentioned, they still pose a threat under such hard conditions, especially with all the crazy modifiers they can have. So I can actually get behind these two challenges. The other one is called The Floor is Lava, in which you have flying but rapidly take damage when you touch the ground, and since most interactables and items and basically everything you need tends to be on the ground, it does pose a significant challenge, one that I haven't actually been able to beat. But the difficulty of the challenges is one thing. The other thing, as usual, is the rewards you get for beating them, which is again PSOL, just like what you get for beating Hellish. Not even an achievement. For the love of God, dear developers, this isn't the 80s anymore. You can't just reward players with a text saying they did it next to their high score for this stuff. Instead, why not make completing each challenge and each victory over Hellish with a different character unlock a new item that you can encounter within a run? There are so many roguelike games, even great ones like Hades, that do not ever consider this and think that all their unlocks should affect only the starting loadouts or innate abilities of the character you play as. Well, that doesn't need to be the case at all. Once you acknowledge this, it allows so many possibilities for new items to be constantly added to the game itself as the player keeps playing it. It's why games like The Binding of Isaac has like 1,000 items and so many people keep playing it for hundreds and hundreds of hours. Most of your unlocks do not just make your character start with more money or whatever, but they add items to the item pools in the game itself so that you may come across that item and pick it up as any character during any run. If you did this for BPM 2, you would have killed two birds with one stone. Item variety would keep increasing as you played the game more and more, allowing for more and more crazy builds, and beating challenges or the hellish difficulty would be sufficiently rewarded. I could understand being reluctant of this idea too if the game's base item pools were already crowded and unlocking a new item would mean waiting for at least 5 or 6 rounds on the average to find and equip it, but again, BPM's item variety is already quite lacking and you keep finding the same items over and over in every run, so it wouldn't take much for people to pick up the fruits of their labor either. With all of that being said, I think this all covers pretty much everything I love and hate about this game and my personal suggestions on how it could improve. I might have come off as a bit harsh in the last sections, but that doesn't change the fact that I still really loved this game overall and would recommend it to everyone. I only got nitpicky because I loved it so much, but I also see where it could have used some improvement, and I wish it had, because it could have been even better, and I want these developers to see that as well and improve to do even better next time. I criticize because I care. Anyway, that's about it for this video. If you liked it, then consider sticking around for more stuff like this in the future, and be sure to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below. And until the next time, take care of yourself. Thanks for watching.